we've, but for the first time and in the first place, all throughout human history, if you're in the UK, if you're in the USA, etc.,
Mm,
I don't believe I don't believe you could show me a law. I don't think you could show me any law where you could say,
mm,
okay, this is genuinely discriminatory
right.
against this group of people. And I don't think people have sort of looked up and realized that. I think a lot of the problems that we have, number one, stem from us just being too comfortable, but also stem
Mm,
from the fact that perhaps the fights that we should be fighting are not clear and obvious in the way that they
yes.
sort of used to be. I mean, I don't know what
Yeah.
the do we need any more civil rights fights? Maybe we don't,
Right.
but people want to fight them.
Yeah, it's a very important point. You know, you're very blessed if you live in an era where people care about microaggressions
Yeah.
against you. You know, you're very, very lucky. Most of human history was very, very aggressive, and it
Yes.
didn't care. It didn't care.
Macroaggressions.
Macroaggressions,
Yeah.
huge macroaggressions on a huge scale,
Yeah.
and nobody had time for your microaggressions. And it's a tendency of the age to believe that if you fiddle with these remaining things, you do so with the force you previously applied to macroaggressions, you will solve the whole thing.
Mm.
I think actually we're being distracted, among other things, at the moment from things that are not solvable, but very, very worth addressing.
Mhm.
And we're being derailed by people who are dishonest actors. And let me give you an example.
Sure.
I think there are significant swathes of America. I might say, I'm not a party political person, but I might say notably in certain democratic areas run by the Democrat Party, where incarceration rates for Black Americans, illiteracy rates for Black Americans, educational attainment for Black Americans, employment rates for Black Americans is dire.
Mhm.
And in areas, I mean, we see this with recent rioting, in areas very often where there is a Black mayor, a Black police chief, a Black congressman,
Yeah.
and so on. And then everyone starts talking about how everyone has got racism embedded in the system, and how if we address 1619 and the founding fathers and pull this down and that down, we'll solve it. And you think,
Yeah.
of course you want to think that,
Yeah.
because the job you should be doing is hard.
Mm.
The job you should be doing is hard, and that is, for instance, to do all of the things that would be needed to make sure that this kind of social breakdown didn't occur.
Yes.
Couldn't occur. That's hard. It's the most worthwhile thing to do if you're in charge of that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's much easier to just go around talking about how, everyone should take the knee at NBA games or something like that.
Well,
And that's what
I'll,
we're being distracted on.
look,
We're being distracted.
honestly, I rarely ever use the phrase "as a black man,"
Mm,
but as a black man,
mm,
this is one thing that jars me so much. It
mm,
jars me so
mm,
much because, and part of the reason, there's lots of reasons why I lean more conservative than I lean more to the left, but one of the big ones is this. On the left side of the spectrum, and with a lot of these liberals and progressives, just there's so much the levels of virtue signaling
yeah.
and condescension and wanting to talk the talk
Mm,
and say what seems to be popular and what you're supposed to say without actually addressing or even wanting to address or even
mm,
acknowledge the genuine issue,
mm,
right?
mm,
So
mm.
even if you take something like the Black Lives Matter movement, right? I would love it. I would love it if there was a Black Lives Matter movement that really was what it said on the tin,
Right.
right? I think
Right.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
USA in particular actually needs a movement called. I actually think it needs a Black Lives
Mm,
Matter movement,
mm,
but I don't think it needs a Black Lives Matter movement that is solely focused on the rare and unfortunate incidents where a black person happens to be killed by a white police officer
right. Right.
in dubious circumstances, which happens
Yeah.
which happens a couple times a year. A couple
Yeah.
times a year is too much, right? In
Yeah.
the, in
Yeah.
last year, there were over 7,000 black people killed, over 7,000 murders, right? Can this be spoken about?
Mm,
Even here in
mm.
the UK, what about things like knife crime? As soon
I
as you want
know.
to
I know.
as soon as you want to
Exactly.
have the real conversation, if you're white, they're going to want to call you racist. If you're black, they're gonna try to say that you're an Uncle Tom or you're a coon or what. And like,
Yeah.
I actually genuinely care about these issues. So for
Yeah.
people who are just being dishonest and who want to say, just scream institutional racism and systemic racism and structural racism and white supremacy, I'm like, this is not helpful. In fact,
That's right.
as far as I'm concerned, I'm like, you're part of the problem because
Yeah,
you're
yeah, yeah.
preventing the problem from being discussed. This comes back to what we were talking about earlier, that you're preventing this conversation from happening honestly,
Yeah.
and therefore you're preventing any real solutions. Look, if we could somehow eliminate all racism from everybody's heart, all racism, right? Would these problems still exist? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. So that suggests very strongly to me that the primary issue we're dealing here is not some sort of specter of white supremacy or structural racism or institutional racism, et cetera. It's absent fathers. It's lack of education
Right.
attainment. Perhaps it's lack of investment in certain areas. There are a whole bunch of things that we can talk about, but instead it's like the answer is always racism, and then
Yes.
people want to backtrack and retrofit the answer racism and apply it to everything, even where it totally doesn't make sense. And it's very, very frustrating to me.
That is such a good point. Yeah, and the example you give, knife crime in the UK, US, Black Lives Matter protests, is exactly the one, because we have got in the UK this sort of mini version of this, which goes around where every time there's a spike in knife crime in London, for instance, we have this sort of crock discussion. Either it gets onto stop and search policies of the police, which is like highly specific and not really the point. It's a bit of a point, but it's not the point.
Yeah.
And you either get onto that, or you get these weird generalizations about how we all need to increase hope or something. And I used to notice this with the terrorism discussion over the last couple of decades. You'd have a terrible thing would happen, a terrorist attack, an outrage or something, and the conversation would deliberately go. It seemed to me deliberately go both very macro and very micro at the same time. So you would have people say, "This is why we've got to ensure that internet search engines don't prioritize this on an algorithm," and then they'd say, "And also we've got to make sure that people feel that they're not hopeless," or something like that, or "We've all got our part to play." And I just always thought, no, that neither of those is the point. They're almost perfectly framed to avoid the point.
Yes.
One on one side, too broad for utility, and on the other hand, too specific to remotely deal with the problem. And the example of this with BLM, with knife crime, is a good example of it. If you agreed that the core of a problem, for instance, for Black America, is educational attainments, fatherless families, and much more, then that requires a hell of a lot of work. But it's work that would be the most worth doing work you could do. And the fact that you get these things instead on either side, things that are too broad to be useful and too specific to do anything, is exactly what's replayed in the British context here. Yeah. And I do think this is something we are being effectively manipulated into doing, that the conversation deliberately goes so wide or so shallow, precisely in order that we don't address this. And why don't we? We could get like political unanimity if enough people said, "No, I call bullshit on this. Yeah, this is not the problem."
Yeah. Yes. I don't use the term institutional. I don't use the terms institutional and structural racism much these days, but I think that is the real. I think that's the real systemic racism. The fact that people do not want to actually. Right. People want to say the term. People want to skirt around and talk about this and talk about that, but no one actually if people really cared, as you said, if you look at America, lots of these cities have been run by the same people for the past 4 decades, right? If you genuinely, right, not just throwing up a hashtag or holding up a sign, if you genuinely believe that Black Lives Matter, and you genuinely care about minorities, and you genuinely care about poor people, and you genuinely care about the downtrodden, etc., why don't you actually do something real, something tangible that will help people, right? These companies virtue signaling on social media, putting up a black square, going around forcing people to raise their fist in the air, forcing people. What does this do? Who does this? It does nothing. It's virtue signaling to the maximum. It makes you look like you're some sort of great person or anti-racist or whatever, but people will go do this, and then they go back home and they just get on with their normal business. And and again, even with the rioting and the looting and all the stuff that was going on, I'm like, how many people are getting harmed by this, right? And then even these celebrities, why don't they put their money? They were putting their money to bail out people who destroyed the buildings.
Haven't you? Those celebrities have gone quiet of late. Have you noticed that?
Of course.
I mean, maybe they've run out of cash. I sort of think not. But that's a very good example of just the crassness that some people are willing to engage in.
I do not scam. Put some respect on my name.